There is something about northern Canada that refuses to stay quiet. The land up there holds its secrets deep, under permafrost, under granite, under centuries of snow and ice and silence. Most people who study that part of the world expect to find the expected. They expect caribou trails and birch forests and the echoes of indigenous peoples who have called those territories home for thousands of years. What nobody expected, and I mean nobody, not the government, engineers, not the hydrologists, not the archaeologists who got the call weeks after the initial discovery, was an entire human settlement sitting perfectly preserved at the bottom of a lake in the Canadian North. Structures, objects, evidence of lives lived so far back in time that the date, when it finally came back from the laboratory, made everyone in the room go very, very quiet. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. Let me tell you how this kind of discovery actually happens, because it is never the way the headlines describe it. It is never a clean moment. It is never a triumphant unveiling in a laboratory with music swelling in the background and scientists in white coats holding up artifacts to fluorescent light. It is usually muddy and cold and deeply confusing. It usually starts with something breaking, something being drained or excavated for a completely unrelated reason, and somebody noticing something that should not be there, something that stops them mid-step, something that makes them call over a colleague and say, quietly, "Come look at this." That is how this started, not with a grand archaeological expedition, not with a research grant and a team of university scientists. It started with a drainage project in the subarctic interior of northern Canada, in a region where the land has been largely left alone for the better part of recorded history. Engineers had been tasked with rerouting water flow as part of a broader infrastructure assessment connected to resource development in the region. The lake in question was not famous. It did not appear in travel brochures or nature documentaries. It was the kind of lake that exists by the thousands across the Canadian Shield, cold and dark and unremarkable from the surface, surrounded by boreal forest, visited mainly by loons and black bears and the occasional fishing guide. When the water began to recede, the lakebed started to emerge, inch by inch. The upper layers were what you would expect: silt, decayed organic matter, the bones of fish, the usual sediment record of a lake sitting in the same place for a very long time. Then the machinery operators noticed something in the exposed mud near the northern shore, shapes that did not match the surrounding geology, angles that were too precise to be natural. They stopped the equipment. They photographed what they were seeing, and the photographs went up the chain of command and eventually landed on the desk of someone who knew exactly what they were looking at. What happened after that is a story about time, about how deep time actually is, about how much history is hiding beneath the surfaces of a country that most of the world associates with a few hundred years of colonial settlement and assumes was empty wilderness before that. It was not empty. It was never empty. And what lay at the bottom of that lake was about to make that point in a way that nobody in the official record was fully prepared to handle. The lake, the drain, and the first discovery. The lake sits in what is now the western subarctic of Canada, in a transitional zone between the boreal forest and the beginning of the tundra. The region experiences brutal winters, with temperatures that can drop to -40 and stay there for weeks. In summer, the landscape transforms into something almost impossibly green, the kind of green that only happens when the sun barely sets and every plant that can grow does grow, frantically, as if making up for lost time. It is beautiful, and it is harsh, and it does not forgive errors in judgment. Lakes like this one formed at the end of the last ice age, when the great continental glaciers retreated northward and left behind an entirely reshaped landscape. Glacial meltwater pooled in depressions carved by ice that had been moving across the land for tens of thousands of years. The lakes that formed were often deep and cold and sealed by the surrounding geology into a kind of isolation that preserved what fell into them with unusual fidelity. Organic materials that would decay quickly in open air could survive for thousands of years in the cold, low oxygen conditions at the bottom of a deep glacial lake. This is not speculation. It is well documented in the scientific literature. Lakes are extraordinary archives. They record the world around them layer by layer, year by year, preserving pollen and charcoal and bone and wood in a stratigraphic sequence that archaeologists can read like pages in a book. The drainage project began in late spring, when the ice had finally left the lake surface and the surrounding ground had thawed enough to allow heavy equipment access. The engineers followed standard procedure for this kind of work, establishing drainage channels and monitoring water levels as the lake began to lower. It is worth noting that the project had been approved through all the relevant channels, had undergone environmental assessment, and had received sign-off from multiple government agencies. Nobody had flagged the site as archaeologically sensitive. Why would they? It was a lake, a normal, unremarkable northern Canadian lake. The water dropped slowly over the first 2 weeks, then more quickly as the drainage channels were widened. By the end of the 4th week, significant portions of the lakebed were exposed, and the site supervisor was doing a routine walkabout of the newly revealed terrain when he noticed the first anomaly. He described it later as looking like the corner of a wall. Just the corner, just an angle in the mud, barely 15 centimeters above the surrounding lakebed, dark with sediment, but clearly, unmistakably, a right angle. Not a natural formation, not a boulder or a root system or a glacial erratic. A right angle, the kind that human hands make. He photographed it. He sent the photographs to his project manager. His project manager made a call to the Provincial Heritage Office, and within 72 hours, the drainage project had been suspended and an emergency archaeological assessment team was en route to the site. The team that arrived was small, 3 archaeologists from a university in the region, 1 specialist in indigenous heritage from the provincial government, and 2 field technicians. They arrived in a chartered float plane because the road access to the area was still largely impassable in early spring, and they landed on a small adjacent pond and hiked in with their equipment on their backs. What they found when they reached the site was more than a corner of a wall. It was the beginning of an entire archaeological complex. As the team began to carefully expose and document the structures emerging from the retreating mud, the scale of what they were looking at started to become apparent. This was not a single building. This was not a seasonal camp or a temporary shelter. This was a settlement, organized, deliberate, structured in a way that suggested permanence, that suggested generations of occupation, that suggested a community of people who had chosen this place and built their lives here and stayed. The site stretched along what had been the northern shore of the lake, extending into the shallower water that had once covered the margins of the settlement. The central cluster of structures was dense enough to suggest a village with outlying features, what appeared to be storage pits, processing areas, and in 2 locations, features that the lead archaeologist described in her field notes as potentially ceremonial in nature. She underlined that word, potentially, because at that point nobody had the dating results yet. At that point nobody knew how old any of this was, and the answer, when it came, was the thing that changed everything. The first radiocarbon dates came back from the laboratory roughly 6 weeks after the initial assessment. The team had submitted samples from multiple contexts, charcoal from hearth features, worked bone from what appeared to be tool-making debris, and fragments of organic material recovered from within the wall, structures themselves. The dates came back in a cluster. They were not perfectly uniform, which is normal for complex sites with long occupation histories. But the earliest dates, the ones from the deepest and most clearly undisturbed contexts, clustered around a period that nobody on the team had anticipated. The site was old, not a few hundred years old, not 1,000 years old. The earliest occupation evidence was dating to a period that placed the settlement firmly in the category of what archaeologists working in North America call pre-Columbian antiquity, well before European contact, and significantly older than the historical record of any known settlement in this region. The implications of that were significant enough, but the full picture that emerged as analysis continued was more complicated and in some ways more extraordinary than simple age alone. What they found, the settlement in full. Let me describe what an archaeologist sees when they look at a site like this, because the language of fieldwork is very specific and it is important. They do not see buildings. They see features. They see soil color changes, organic staining, post molds where wooden uprights once stood, hearth deposits with carbon and burned bone, floor surfaces compacted by years of foot traffic, refuse areas where the daily debris of life accumulated and was eventually covered by sediment. They see all of this in cross-section, in profile, in plan, and they piece together from these traces the physical reality of what once existed above the ground. At this site, the features were unusually well preserved. This is one of the defining characteristics of submerged sites, and it is one of the reasons that underwater and formerly underwater archaeology can yield such extraordinary results. The cold, low oxygen environment of the lake bottom had essentially mummified the site. Wood that would have rotted away within decades under open air conditions had survived. Plant fiber cordage had survived. In several cases, organic materials that would be almost unheard of at a comparable dry land site of the same age were present and recoverable and analyzable. This was a rare and extraordinary preservation scenario. The settlement, as it was ultimately mapped and documented, covered an area of approximately 2.5 hectares of the former lakeshore. For context, 2.5 hectares is not enormous by the standards of ancient settlements found in other parts of the world. It is not Çatalhöyük or Jericho. But for the Canadian subarctic, for a region where the archaeological record has historically been sparse, precisely because organic materials do not typically survive, 2.5 hectares of dense, well-stratified, extraordinarily preserved habitation evidence is extraordinary. It is the kind of site that archaeologists who work in this region spend their careers hoping to find and rarely do. The structures themselves were the first thing the team focused on documenting. There were 12 distinct building footprints identified in the initial assessment, with additional possible structures at the margins of the site where the lakebed transitioned to deeper water and excavation was not possible without specialist diving support. The 12 documented structures varied in size and in what appeared to be function. The smallest were roughly circular, with diameters of between 3 and 5 meters. The largest was a roughly rectangular structure measuring approximately 12 meters by 8 meters, significantly larger than anything else at the site, and positioned in what would have been a central and prominent location relative to the other buildings. The construction technique used for the structures was a combination of methods. The wall bases in several cases consisted of stacked stone, the stone sourced from the glacial till that underlies the region and carried to the site, in some cases from considerable distances. Above the stone base, the walls had been constructed using timber, with post molds indicating upright wooden elements, and the surviving organic material, in several cases, showing what appeared to be a wattle and daub construction style, wooden framing infilled with woven plant material and some kind of binding agent, possibly clay, possibly a combination of clay and animal fat or plant resin. Roof construction was harder to determine as the roof elements had collapsed long ago and were represented only by scatter of decayed wood within and around the structures, but the distribution of this material suggested the roofs had been relatively substantial, capable of supporting snow loads, which in this region is not a minor engineering consideration. The people who built these structures had understood their environment. They had built for the climate they were living in. These were not temporary shelters or seasonal camps. These were permanent structures designed to last and to provide protection through the kind of winters that the subarctic delivers. Inside the structures, the floor surfaces were where much of the most informative material was found. Hearths had been constructed in several of the buildings, some centrally placed, others positioned toward one wall, with evidence in a few cases of multiple phases of hearth construction, meaning the hearths had been rebuilt or modified over time, suggesting occupation that spanned not just years but potentially generations. Around and within the hearth deposits, the team found lithic material, the stone tools and tool-making debris that form the backbone of most pre-Columbian archaeological assemblages in North America. The lithic assemblage was extensive. Hundreds of individual pieces were recovered in the initial assessment, with the full excavation ultimately yielding thousands. The raw materials represented in the collection were varied. Some pieces were made from locally available stone, the quartzite and chert that can be found in glacial deposits throughout the region. But a significant number of pieces were made from materials that do not occur naturally anywhere near the site. High-quality flint from sources that lithic specialists subsequently identified as being located hundreds of kilometers to the south and east. Obsidian, volcanic glass, from sources that are even further removed, requiring either long-distance travel or long-distance exchange networks to explain their presence at this site. That last point deserves to sit for a moment. Obsidian, at a subarctic site that the conventional archaeological narrative of the region would suggest was either unoccupied or only sporadically visited by small mobile hunting groups during this period. Obsidian that came from volcanic sources so far away that obtaining it required either an extraordinary journey or an extraordinary network of connections with other communities across a vast geographic area. Neither option is simple. Either option implies a degree of social complexity and geographic reach that challenges the image of isolated, small-scale, technologically limited peoples that has too often been applied to pre-Columbian North America, north of the great civilizations of Mesoamerica and the American Southwest. The bone assemblage was equally revealing. The team recovered animal remains from across the site, and the faunal analysis that followed painted a detailed picture of what the people of this settlement had been eating and how they had been acquiring their food. The expected species were there. Caribou, the large migratory ungulate that has been the backbone of subsistence economies across the subarctic for millennia. Fish, particularly salmonid species, in quantities that suggested systematic harvesting and processing, probably at seasonal runs. Waterfowl, small mammals, but there were also species that were unexpected, species whose bones at this site told a story about either seasonal movement or trade that extended the reach of the community far beyond the immediate landscape of the lake and its surroundings. Marine mammal bone was among the most striking finds. Species that live in the coastal and offshore environments of northern Canada, species that you would not expect to find in the interior subarctic unless people were either traveling to the coast seasonally or exchanging goods with coastal communities. Their presence at this site, in quantities that suggested they were not merely curiosities or rare obtained items, but a regular component of the subsistence strategy, implied connections with the broader northern world that a small, isolated, technologically simple community would not have had. This is the picture that was emerging as the initial assessment gave way to full-scale excavation. Not the picture of a small seasonal camp, not the picture of a brief and unremarkable habitation, the picture of a community, a real community with permanent structures and long-term occupation, with diverse food sources obtained through complex strategies, with access to raw materials from across a wide region, with what appeared to be specialized activity areas and possibly ceremonial or communal spaces. A community that had chosen this lake and this shore and had built something here that lasted long enough to be preserved by the cold, dark water that eventually covered it into our own time. Who lived here? The people behind the settlement. One of the most common questions that emerges when a site like this becomes public knowledge is the question of identity. Who were these people? What do we call them? How do they fit into the genealogy of peoples that we know or think we know, occupied North America before and during and after the period when European contact began to reshape the continent? It is a reasonable question, and it is also a complicated one, and the complications are worth understanding because they say something important about the limits of how we have traditionally approached the deep history of North America. The conventional framework for understanding pre-Columbian archaeology in the subarctic and subarctic regions of Canada is built on a relatively small number of well-documented cultural traditions, identified primarily through their distinctive lithic technologies, the specific ways in which they made and used stone tools. These traditions have names: the Shield Archaic, the Maritime Archaic, the Plano tradition. Later, the various cultural complexes associated with Algonquian and Athapascan-speaking peoples in the historic period. Each of these traditions is defined by a characteristic toolkit, a set of tool forms and manufacturing techniques that allow archaeologists to identify related assemblages across a large geographic area and assign them to a particular cultural identity, a particular group of people who made things in a particular way. The lithic assemblage from this site did not fit neatly into any of these established categories. Some of the tool forms were familiar, recognizable variants of types known from other Shield Archaic and Plano sites in the broader region. But others were unusual, different in their morphology, different in their manufacturing technique, representing approaches to stone tool production that the specialists brought in to analyze the collection were not immediately able to match to any known reference collection in the regional or national literature. This is significant for a couple of reasons. One possibility is that the assemblage represents a local variant of a known tradition, a group of people doing things slightly differently from their contemporaries because of local conditions or local preferences or the particular history of their community. This happens. Regional variation within broader cultural traditions is normal and expected and does not necessarily imply anything more dramatic than the ordinary diversity of human cultural expression. But another possibility is that the assemblage represents something genuinely novel, a cultural tradition or a population that has not previously been documented in the archaeological record of this region. People who were here and who made things in ways that do not match the established narrative of who was here and when. The ancient DNA analysis that was conducted on human skeletal material recovered from 2 burial features identified within the settlement added another dimension to the identity question. The genetic profiles recovered from the remains were analyzed by a specialist laboratory and compared against the growing database of ancient and modern indigenous North American genetic profiles. The results indicated a population with genetic affinities to multiple known groups, but with a profile that was not identical to any of them. The analysts described the individuals represented as belonging to a population that shared ancestry with the broader family of peoples who have occupied northern North America since the initial peopling of the continent but showing a degree of genetic distinctiveness, suggesting the community had been relatively isolated for a substantial period. What does isolation mean in this context? In population genetics, isolation refers to a reduction in gene flow between one population and surrounding populations. It happens when geographic barriers or cultural practices or simple distance limit the movement of people between communities. In the subarctic, geographic isolation is easy to achieve. The terrain is vast and difficult, and the distances between habitable areas can be enormous. A community established at a productive lake in the interior could, under the right conditions, persist for many generations with limited contact with other communities, developing its own genetic distinctiveness over time while maintaining the cultural knowledge and subsistence strategies needed to survive in the environment it inhabited. The burial features themselves were informative beyond the genetic material they yielded. 2 formal burial areas were identified at the site. One was located within the largest structure, the central rectangular building that had been provisionally identified as a communal or ceremonial space. The burials here were 3 in number, 2 adults and 1 child, interred in a manner that showed clear intentionality and care. The bodies had been placed in prepared pits with grave goods accompanying each individual. Stone tools, worked bone objects, in one case an arrangement of red ochre that stained the surrounding sediment in a manner that suggested it had originally been present in considerable quantity, applied to the body or to materials placed within the burial. Red ochre in burial contexts is one of the most widely distributed features of ancient human ceremonialism across the entire northern hemisphere. It appears in burials on multiple continents, in cultural contexts spanning tens of thousands of years of human prehistory. Its presence does not in itself point to any specific cultural affiliation, but it does point to something. It points to a community that had developed formal approaches to death and to the treatment of the dead, a community that invested time and symbolic resources in the act of burial, a community with, in other words, a rich and complex ceremonial life that left material traces in the archaeological record. The second burial area was external to the structures, located in a slightly elevated area of what had been the lake shore immediately to the east of the main settlement. It was larger, containing at least 7 individuals in varying states of preservation. The orientation of the burials, the positioning of the bodies, the distribution of grave goods, all of these features showed internal consistency, suggesting a coherent and practiced burial tradition rather than ad hoc or improvised treatment of the dead. The site specialist documented the area carefully and worked in close consultation with indigenous heritage representatives throughout the process, following protocols designed to ensure respectful treatment of ancestral remains. The people who built and lived in this settlement were not mysteries in the sense of being unknowable. They were human beings. They woke up in those structures. They went out in the cold. They hunted and fished and processed food and made tools and raised children and buried their dead with ochre and objects and ceremony. They had a community and they had a history and they had relationships with the land around this lake that were intimate and detailed and built up over a very long time. What was mysterious was not who they were in any fundamental sense. What was mysterious was where they fit in the story we have been telling about the deep past of North America. And fitting them into that story was going to require revising the story in some significant ways. The artifacts, objects that should not exist. Every archaeological site has its signature objects, the things that end up in the display case, the things that the researchers spend years debating and the public ends up being most curious about. For this site, there were several categories of artifact that generated the most significant discussion and the most sustained scientific attention, some because of what they were made of, some because of how they were made, and some because of what they appeared to represent, the ideas and symbols and knowledge systems encoded in their physical form. The bone tools were among the first to attract attention from outside the core archaeological team. The assemblage of worked bone recovered from the site was extensive and diverse, representing a sophisticated toolkit built around the processing and use of animal raw materials. There were needles, thin, precisely made bone needles with drilled eyes, the kind of tool needed when producing fitted, carefully sewn clothing, not rough hide coverings, but actual tailored garments with close-fitting seams. Needles like these appear in the archaeological record of northern peoples across a huge geographic range and going back a very long time. What was notable at this site was the quantity and quality of the needle assemblage, suggesting a community in which textile production and garment making were highly developed, specialized activities carried out at significant scale. There were also a number of composite tool elements, pieces of worked bone and antler that had been crafted to serve as hafting elements, the handles and foreshafts, and socketed bases that allowed stone points and blades to be attached to wooden shafts and handles. The workmanship on these pieces was, according to the analysts, consistently high. The shaping was precise. The drilling of sockets and holes was carefully done. These were the products of skilled craftspeople who understood their materials well and had spent years developing expertise in working them. This is the kind of evidence that tends not to survive well at most archaeological sites in the northern boreal and subarctic zones. Its presence here in such quantity was a function of the extraordinary preservation conditions created by the lake, and it gave the team a window into aspects of technology that normally remain invisible. But the artifacts that generated the most sustained discussion were a collection of objects that the lead archaeologist described in the site report as carved representational pieces. There were 11 of them in total, recovered from multiple locations across the site. They were made from a variety of materials: bone, stone. One was carved from what proved to be antler, and another from a dense, dark wood that subsequent analysis identified as a species that does not grow anywhere near the site, that in fact does not grow anywhere in the Canadian North at all, its natural range being confined to a forested zone considerably further south. The carved pieces depicted figures, animal figures in most cases. A caribou in one, the rack of antlers rendered with careful attention to the characteristic branching pattern. A bird of some kind, likely a loon, its long neck and distinctive silhouette unmistakable. Two figures that appeared to represent bears, though their posture was unusual, almost upright, in a configuration that one of the consulting specialists suggested might represent a deliberate anthropomorphization rather than a naturalistic depiction of an animal in its normal posture. And then there were two pieces that did not obviously depict animals at all. The first was a disc, roughly 8 centimeters in diameter, made from the same dark southern wood as the bird carving, with a pattern incised on one face. The pattern consisted of a series of concentric circles with radiating lines, a sun-like motif that would not be out of place in the symbolic vocabulary of many indigenous North American traditions. The second non-animal carving was the one that generated the most debate. It was a small figurine, perhaps 12 centimeters tall, made from bone, depicting a human figure. Not a generic human figure, a figure in a very specific posture, arms raised and slightly extended, head tilted back, the posture of someone in what the analyst cautiously described as a possible state of altered consciousness or ritual performance. A shaman, the word hung in the air at the first specialist briefing where the piece was presented. Nobody rushed to commit to it, but nobody dismissed it either. Shamanic figurines and representations of spiritual practitioners appear in the archaeological record of northern peoples across Eurasia and North America. The idea that peoples of the subarctic had complex spiritual practitioners and practices is not in itself surprising or contested. What matters archaeologically is what such a figure tells you about the community that made it. It tells you that this community had a concept of specialized spiritual roles, that it had a material culture rich enough to invest time in the production of non-utilitarian objects, that it had a symbolic system sophisticated enough to encode the concept of ritual performance in three-dimensional form. These are not the hallmarks of a marginal or impoverished community clinging to survival at the edge of the habitable world. These are the hallmarks of a community with surplus, with specialization, with a rich and developed inner life. The piece of carved wood from a southern species deserves particular attention because of what it implies about the reach and the connections of this community. Wood does not lie about where it came from. The cellular structure of wood preserves species-specific characteristics that can be identified through laboratory analysis with high confidence. The wood in these two carved objects came from trees that grow far to the south of the site. Getting that wood to this location required either travel or trade, and probably both, sustained over time and organized through relationships with communities in other regions. This is not a community that was sealed off from the world. This is a community that was connected, that was in communication with people and places at considerable distances, that was participating in some kind of broader network of exchange that we have only the most fragmentary evidence of. The lithic pieces in the assemblage also included several items that went beyond functional tools into something that might be called art. Stones that had been shaped not for cutting or scraping, but for aesthetic or symbolic purposes. One in particular was a piece of red jasper, a beautiful material not found locally that had been worked into a biface form, perfectly symmetrical, extremely thin, technically accomplished, beyond what would be required for any practical cutting task. It was, in the assessment of the lithic specialist who analyzed it, a prestige object, a demonstration of skill, a thing made to be admired, a thing that communicated something about the person who possessed it or the community that produced it, a statement of knowledge and capability and access to beautiful and difficult materials from distant sources. Across all of these artifact categories, a consistent picture was emerging. The people of this settlement were not simply surviving. They were living with sophistication, with symbolic depth, with technical skill, with connections that extended far beyond the horizon visible from any point on the lakeshore. They were embedded in a world that was larger and more complex than the narrative of isolated, technologically simple subarctic peoples has traditionally acknowledged, and the implications of that realization were going to reach beyond the site itself, beyond this particular lake and these particular structures and these particular objects, into some much larger and much more uncomfortable questions about what we think we know about the history of North America before European contact. The timeline problem, pre-Columbian implications. Here is where the story becomes genuinely uncomfortable for the established narrative. Not uncomfortable in a fringe or conspiratorial sense, but uncomfortable in the way that good science is supposed to be uncomfortable, the way evidence that challenges what you thought you knew is supposed to make you stop and reassess and ask whether the framework you have been using was adequate. The radiocarbon dates from this site place the main occupation of the settlement in a period that preceded European contact in the broader region by a margin that was, in the words of the dating laboratory report, statistically unambiguous. This was a pre-Columbian site. This was a site that was occupied, possibly continuously, for a substantial span of time during which the existence of this community left no trace in any written record, because there were no written records being kept by anyone in North America, north of Mesoamerica, during this period. All the history of this community, all the generations of people who lived here and died here and built these structures and made these objects and maintained these connections across hundreds of kilometers of northern landscape, exists only in the archaeological record. And for most of Canadian history, the relevant portion of that record was sitting at the bottom of a lake. This raises a question that the discovery has pushed to the surface of academic and public discourse in the region. How many other sites like this one are sitting beneath the water, beneath the permafrost, beneath the accumulated layers of time and subsequent land use in the vast territories of northern Canada? The subarctic and subarctic zones of Canada cover an enormous area. They are among the least archaeologically investigated regions in North America, not because nothing happened there, but because the combination of environmental conditions, geographic remoteness, and the historical priorities of Canadian archaeology have resulted in a research coverage that is, to put it charitably, incomplete. The Canadian Shield, the great expanse of ancient Precambrian rock that underlies most of northern and central Canada, is dotted with tens of thousands of lakes. Most of those lakes have never been archaeologically investigated. Most will never be. There are not enough archaeologists, not enough funding, not enough years in the careers of the researchers who work in this region to systematically investigate even a small fraction of them. What this means is that the picture we have of pre-Columbian occupation in the Canadian North is built on a fundamentally biased sample, skewed toward the sites that are accessible, that are above the waterline, that happen to have been in the path of development projects or chance discoveries that brought them to archaeological attention. The settlement at the bottom of this lake was invisible for its entire post-occupation history. Nobody knew it was there. It was not in anyone's oral traditions, at least not in any form that had been recorded and made available to the researchers who arrived to excavate it. It was not in any historical account. It was not on any map. It existed in complete invisibility until the water receded and exposed the corner of a wall in the mud. And if the drainage project had been carried out differently, if the water had been redirected rather than lowered, if the site had been on a different part of the lakebed that remained submerged, it would still be invisible today. This is the timeline problem, not a problem with the dates themselves, which are robust and well established. The problem is what the dates imply about the shape of our ignorance. If this settlement existed here, in this region, during this period, and we had no idea, what else existed that we still have no idea about? The conservative answer is quite a lot. The honest answer is we genuinely do not know. The provocative answer, the one that some researchers in the field have begun to articulate with increasing directness in the years since this discovery, is that the picture of pre-Columbian North America that has been presented in textbooks and popular history and documentary films for the past century may be wrong in ways that matter. Not slightly wrong at the margins, wrong in its fundamental premises about the density, the complexity, and the connectivity of ancient North American societies. This is not a fringe position. It is not the territory of pseudoscience or alternative archaeology or YouTube conspiracy channels. It is a position that has been building in the mainstream of North American archaeology for several decades, supported by a growing body of evidence from sites across the continent that point consistently toward greater pre-Columbian complexity than the conventional narrative had assumed. The settlement beneath the lake is one piece of that evidence, but it sits within a much larger pattern of revision and rethinking that is currently underway in the field. Consider what we know about the scale of pre-Columbian populations in North America. Early estimates produced in the 19th and early 20th centuries by scholars working within a framework that often actively minimized indigenous presence in order to justify colonial land appropriation placed the pre-contact population of North America north of Mexico at a few million people. Later scholarship, using more sophisticated demographic methods and a broader base of archaeological evidence, has progressively revised those estimates upward. Current estimates from researchers working in this field place the pre-contact population of the Americas at numbers that would make the continent one of the most densely populated regions of the world by the standards of the period in question. More people means more settlements. More settlements means more archaeological sites. More archaeological sites means more evidence sitting in the ground or under the water, or beneath the permafrost, waiting to be found. The settlement at the bottom of this northern Canadian lake is a data point in a much larger data set that is still being assembled. And the picture that data set is beginning to suggest is one of a pre-Columbian North America that was more populated, more settled, more connected, more sophisticated, and more historically complex than anything that has been taught in North American schools for most of the past century. The suppressed history angle, what was kept quiet and why. This is the part of the story where the word suppressed tends to appear, and it is worth being careful about what that word means in this context, because it can mean several different things, and not all of them are equally supported by evidence. In the narrowest sense, there was no conspiracy to suppress information about the settlement beneath the lake. The discovery was reported through appropriate channels. An archaeological assessment was conducted. The results have been published, or at least circulated in preliminary form, in the academic literature. Indigenous community representatives were consulted throughout the process. The story has been covered in regional media. Nothing was hidden. But there is a broader sense of suppression that is worth talking about, a structural suppression that operates not through deliberate concealment, but through the cumulative effect of institutional priorities, funding decisions, interpretive frameworks, and the sociology of knowledge in a discipline that has historically been practiced primarily by people who are not descended from the communities they study. And in this broader sense, the history of this region and of the pre-Columbian peoples who inhabited it has been, if not suppressed, then consistently undervalued, underfunded, and underrepresented in the mainstream narrative of Canadian and North American history. The archaeology of the Canadian subarctic has never attracted the funding or the public attention of the archaeology of the American Southwest, or the civilizations of Mesoamerica, or even the well-studied cultures of the eastern woodlands of North America. The reasons for this are partly practical. The region is remote and expensive to work in. The preservation conditions are difficult. The organic materials that give sites their most vivid human detail tend not to survive under normal conditions. But the reasons are also cultural and political. The peoples of the subarctic have been systematically portrayed in both popular culture and in much of the academic literature of the colonial period as simple, mobile, technologically limited groups who were incapable of the kinds of complexity and permanence that the settlement beneath this lake clearly represents. This portrayal served a function. It served the function of justifying the treatment of these peoples and their territories by colonial governments and by the settler population that followed. If the indigenous peoples of northern Canada were simple nomads with no fixed attachment to the land, no permanent settlements, no complex social organization, then the colonization of their territories was easier to frame as development of empty or underutilized land rather than the dispossession of established communities with deep historical roots. This framing was not accidental. It was cultivated and maintained through the selection of evidence that fit the narrative and the dismissal or de-emphasis of evidence that challenged it. There are specific documented cases in the history of Canadian archaeology where sites and findings that challenge the narrative of simple, pre-complex northern peoples were minimized or contested in ways that had more to do with interpretive politics than with the actual quality of the evidence. Sites that showed evidence of permanent settlement in regions where the conventional narrative said there should be no permanent settlement. Sites that showed evidence of long-distance trade and complex social organization in regions where the conventional narrative assumed small, isolated, self-sufficient bands. These sites were not always given the attention and resources that their significance warranted. The settlement beneath the lake is the most dramatic recent example of this pattern, but it is not isolated. It is part of a much longer history of archaeological evidence in the Canadian North being fitted, uncomfortably and sometimes inaccurately, into a framework that was constructed by and for purposes that were not purely scientific. The recognition of this is not a rejection of science. It is a demand for better science, for science that is willing to let the evidence lead where it actually leads, rather than where the inherited narrative says it should go. The indigenous communities whose ancestors may have built and occupied this settlement have their own perspectives on this history, and those perspectives are important. The oral traditions and knowledge systems of northern peoples contain information about the deep past of the region that the archaeological record alone cannot provide. These traditions have often been dismissed as myth or legend by researchers who did not take seriously the possibility that oral transmission could preserve accurate historical information over very long time spans. More recent scholarship has demonstrated in multiple cases across different regions and cultures that oral traditions can indeed encode accurate historical information over hundreds and even thousands of years. The famous example of Aboriginal Australian oral traditions describing coastline configurations that were flooded at the end of the last ice age more than 7,000 years ago is the most striking, but it is not the only one. If the oral traditions of the peoples whose ancestors lived in this region contain information about the settlement at the bottom of the lake, that information has not yet been formally incorporated into the archaeological interpretation of the site. That is a gap. It is a gap that the research community is working to address through the kind of sustained, respectful consultation with indigenous knowledge holders that was not always practiced in earlier phases of Canadian archaeology. The story of this settlement is not finished. It is not a closed case. It is an open question, and some of the most important information needed to answer it may be held by communities who have been waiting for someone to ask. Other drained lakes, other mysteries, a pattern emerges. The discovery beneath this Canadian lake did not happen in isolation, and one of the most important things about it is the company it keeps, because once you start looking at the global record of submerged or formerly submerged archaeological sites, a pattern emerges that is both striking in its geographic breadth and deeply challenging for the way we have constructed our understanding of ancient history. The most famous of these sites is probably Doggerland, the now submerged landmass that once connected Britain to continental Europe, flooded by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. What was once a vast, richly inhabited landscape, home to hunter-gatherer communities for thousands of years, now lies under the North Sea. Trawlers have been pulling up Mesolithic tools and animal bones and occasional human remains from the seabed for over a century. The scale of what was lost, not just archaeologically, but in terms of our understanding of the peopling of northwestern Europe, is difficult to overstate. In Southeast Asia, the Sunda Shelf presents a similar story on an even larger scale. During the glacial maximum, sea levels were low enough that much of what is now the shallow ocean between the Indonesian islands and the Southeast Asian mainland was dry land, a vast subcontinent that researchers have named Sundaland. This landmass, now entirely beneath the sea, was potentially home to human populations for tens of thousands of years during the period of maximum glaciation. Some researchers have suggested that Sundaland may have been one of the most significant population centers of the ancient world, a hypothesis that remains difficult to test precisely because the primary evidence for it is now underwater. In the Americas, the story of submerged prehistory is only beginning to be told. The coastlines of North and South America during the period of glacial maximum were dramatically different from their present configuration. Sea levels were lower, often by 100 meters or more, exposing vast coastal plains that are now underwater. These coastal zones, in the standard model of the peopling of the Americas, are precisely the areas that the first inhabitants of the continent would have passed through and settled as they moved south from the Beringian land bridge or along the Pacific coast. If these coastal populations left significant archaeological traces, and there is every reason to think they would have, almost all of those traces are now inaccessible, sitting under 50 to 100 meters of Pacific or Atlantic seawater. The few submerged coastal sites that have been found in the Americas, investigated using specialized diving or remotely operated vehicle techniques, have confirmed that people were indeed living in these now submerged coastal zones during the periods in question. The sites off the coast of Florida have been particularly productive, yielding evidence of occupation dating back many thousands of years. Similar sites have been documented off the Pacific coast of North America, off the coasts of Central and South America, each one adding to the picture of a pre-Columbian coastal world that we have only the faintest impression of, because most of the evidence is inaccessible. In Canada specifically, several sites have emerged in recent decades that collectively suggest the submerged settlement is not an anomaly, but part of a broader pattern of more complex and more ancient occupation than the conventional narrative acknowledges. In British Columbia, the Haida Gwaii archipelago has yielded archaeological evidence from submerged and formerly submerged contexts suggesting continuous human occupation. Going back to a period shortly after the retreat of the glaciers, occupation that predates the accepted arrival of the peoples whose descendants inhabit the region today. On the Pacific coast more broadly, the evidence for early occupation has been pushing back consistently as new sites are found and new dating techniques are applied to existing collections. In the interior of the continent, the picture is more fragmentary but no less suggestive. Several lakes across the Canadian Shield and the Boreal Zone have, when their levels have dropped for natural or human-caused reasons, exposed archaeological material ranging from isolated tools to more complex features like fish weirs and trap systems, evidence of organized systematic exploitation of aquatic resources by communities whose investment in the labor required to construct these features implies a degree of permanence, an organization that does not match the nomadic, simple model. The fish weirs are worth dwelling on for a moment because they represent a category of evidence that is both archaeologically significant and often overlooked. A fish weir is a structure built in a river or lake to trap or concentrate fish, allowing their efficient harvesting. Building a fish weir requires substantial labor, skill, and an understanding of the water system and the fish behavior within it. It also requires planning and coordination, because the most effective weirs are communal resources that benefit a group rather than an individual. The presence of fish weirs in a region implies settled or semi-settled communities with the organizational capacity to build and maintain them, with the knowledge of local aquatic resources to make them effective, and with the social structures to manage their use fairly. Fish weirs have been found at multiple submerged and formerly submerged locations across northern Canada. Some of these weirs are very old. The specific dating varies by site, but several examples have been dated to the mid-Holocene at the youngest, with some potentially older if the associated materials can be reliably dated. Their existence in the archaeological record of regions that have been characterized as home to simple, mobile, technologically limited peoples is evidence that the characterization was always inadequate. People who build fish weirs are not simple. People who build fish weirs are organized, knowledgeable, and embedded in a relationship with their landscape that is sophisticated and long-term. The settlement beneath the Canadian lake sits within this broader pattern. It is the most dramatic, single example of what the pattern suggests, but it is not the only one. And the implication of the full pattern, taken together, is that the pre-Columbian history of northern North America needs to be substantially rewritten. Not because anyone lied, though some people did minimize evidence that was inconvenient, but because the evidence that is now accumulating points consistently toward a different story than the one we have been telling. The scientific debate, what mainstream archaeology says, and what it struggles with. It would be easy, and it would be wrong, to frame the significance of this discovery as primarily a matter of the mainstream versus the alternative, as though the established scientific community is simply resistant to the truth, while a small band of brave revisionists fights to bring it to light. The reality is more interesting and more nuanced than that, and understanding the genuine scientific debate around this site and the broader questions it raises is more useful than a simple heroes and villains narrative. The mainstream of North American archaeology is not a monolith. It is a community of scholars with genuinely diverse views, engaged in ongoing debates that often get heated and that turn, as academic debates always do, on questions of evidence quality, interpretive method, and the standards that should be applied in assessing competing claims. The settlement beneath the lake has entered this debate as a significant new piece of evidence, and the response within the mainstream has been neither uniform acceptance nor uniform dismissal. It has been, as you would expect for a genuinely complex and surprising finding, a mixture of careful assessment, productive disagreement, and the slow grinding of scientific consensus formation. The dating results, as mentioned earlier, are robust. Radiocarbon dating is a mature technology with well-understood error margins, and the dates from this site have been reproduced across multiple independent samples from well-stratified contexts. Nobody in the serious scientific literature is contesting the dates. The settlement is old. That is settled. What is being debated is interpretation. The debate centers on several key questions. The first is the settlement's relationship to known archaeological cultures in the region. The lithic assemblage, as noted, does not fit neatly into established typological categories. Some researchers read this as indicating a previously undocumented cultural tradition. Others read it as indicating the site falls within a poorly sampled range of variation within known traditions, that the apparent novelty is an artifact of our limited comparative sample rather than a genuine novelty in the past. This is a legitimate methodological debate. The second major debate concerns the question of complexity. How complex was this settlement? The evidence for permanent architecture, for diverse subsistence strategies, for long-distance exchange connections, for symbolic and ceremonial activity, all points toward a level of social complexity that is at the high end of what the conventional narrative for this region would predict. But there is a debate about how to read this evidence, about whether the features identified as indicators of complexity necessarily imply the degree of social organization and cultural sophistication that the more enthusiastic interpretations suggest. This debate reflects a broader tension in archaeology between what might be called maximalist and minimalist interpretive approaches. Maximalists tend to read ambiguous evidence in favor of greater complexity, on the grounds that the archaeological record systematically underrepresents the richness and complexity of past societies due to preservation biases. Minimalists tend to apply a more conservative standard of evidence, on the grounds that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that the history of archaeology is full of sites that were initially interpreted as more complex or more ancient than they turned out to be on further investigation. Both positions have their strengths. The maximalist position is supported by the general trend in recent decades of revised estimates of pre-Columbian complexity that have consistently been upward, as new evidence and new methods have consistently revealed more sophisticated ancient societies than earlier researchers had recognized. The minimalist position is supported by the genuine history of overclaiming in archaeology, of sites interpreted as proving dramatic, theses that subsequent investigation revealed were more mundane than initially suggested. The truth, as it usually is in science, lies in the careful, patient accumulation of evidence and the willingness to revise interpretations as new data becomes available. The third major debate concerns the implications of the site for understanding the pre-Columbian history of the broader region. Here, the disagreement is sharpest. Some researchers argue that the settlement beneath the lake is evidence that the conventional narrative of pre-Columbian northern North America is fundamentally inadequate, that the region was more densely populated, more permanently settled, and more socially complex than the textbooks suggest, and that this has implications for everything from how we understand the spread of human populations across the continent to how we understand the nature of the contact between indigenous peoples and European colonizers. Others argue that the settlement is an extraordinary site precisely because it is exceptional, that it represents an unusual or even unique situation rather than a typical pattern, and that generalizing from one exceptional site to broad conclusions about regional prehistory is methodologically unjustified. This is the standard scientific caution about sample size, and it is a legitimate concern. One site, even a spectacular one, cannot by itself rewrite the history of a continent. But here is where the site's context matters. The settlement beneath the lake is not, as this account has already noted, the only recent evidence pointing toward greater pre-Columbian complexity in the Canadian North. It is one piece of a growing body of evidence that includes revised population estimates, new submerged site discoveries in multiple regions, the reanalysis of existing collections using new methods that have revealed previously unrecognized complexity, and the incorporation of indigenous knowledge and oral tradition into archaeological interpretation in ways that have consistently illuminated aspects of the past that the documentary record alone could not reveal. The settlement is a striking individual example, but it matters most as part of a pattern. There is also a debate at the methodological level about the application of radiocarbon dating to materials from submerged contexts. Submerged sites present specific challenges for radiocarbon dating, primarily because of the possibility that carbon in aquatic contexts has been subject to what researchers call the reservoir effect, in which the carbon in organic materials absorbs carbon from the surrounding water, rather than the atmosphere, potentially giving dates that are older than the actual age of the material. The research team addressed this concern by dating multiple types of material from multiple contexts and cross-checking the results against each other for consistency, a standard approach that reduces the likelihood of systematic error. The scientific reviewers of the site report accepted that the team's approach was appropriate and that the dates were reliable. But the debate about methodology and interpretation continues in the specialist literature, as it should. What this means for the public understanding of the discovery is that the story is not finished. The initial excavation produced a preliminary picture that is extraordinary and significant. The full analysis of the recovered materials is ongoing, with specialists in multiple disciplines working through collections that will take years to fully document and interpret. The ancient DNA analysis has opened questions that will require broader comparative studies to address. The paleobotanical analysis of plant materials from the site is in its early stages. The geoarchaeological analysis of the sediment sequence, which will tell the story of how the lake came to cover the settlement and how the settlement was preserved, is underway. The full story of this place and its inhabitants will take a generation of scholarship to tell. The mystery deepens, questions. The evidence raises but cannot yet answer. Every significant archaeological discovery does two things at once. It answers some questions and it generates new ones. The ratio of new questions to answered questions is, for the settlement beneath the lake, heavily weighted toward the former. And several of the new questions that the evidence has generated are genuinely profound, the kind of questions that reach beyond the specifics of this site into fundamental issues about human history in the Americas. The first is the question of the lake itself. How did the settlement come to be submerged? The settlement was clearly built on dry land at the margin of a lake, in the way that lakeside settlements throughout human history have been built. At some point, the water level of the lake rose high enough to cover the settlement and eventually to bury it under the accumulating sediment of the lakebed. This process of inundation presumably happened after the occupation of the settlement had ended, either because the community had already abandoned the site for reasons we do not know, or because the rising water drove them away. The geoarchaeological analysis of the sediment sequence is intended to address this question, and preliminary results suggest that the inundation happened relatively rapidly, which is one of the factors that contributed to the extraordinary preservation. But what caused the lake level to rise? The subarctic landscape is dynamic. Permafrost thaws and freezes over centuries, causing subsidence and uplift that can change local drainage patterns. Beaver activity, which can alter water level significantly, is documented in the archaeological record of the region going back thousands of years. Climate change, even the relatively modest climate fluctuations of the mid-Holocene, can shift precipitation patterns enough to raise or lower lake levels substantially. All of these are possible explanations. None has been definitively identified as the cause at this particular site, and there is the intriguing possibility, which the researchers have not dismissed, that the event that ended the occupation of the settlement was sudden and catastrophic enough that people left with little time to recover their possessions, which would explain the unusual density of artifact material on the floor surfaces of the structures. The second profound question is where the community went. If the settlement was abandoned, whether before or during the inundation, the people who lived there did not simply vanish. They went somewhere. They joined other communities, or they founded new ones, or they died out. Their descendants are somewhere in the genetic record of modern North American indigenous peoples. The ancient DNA analysis is intended to help address this question by identifying the genetic affinities of the settlement's population and looking for their signature in the broader database of ancient and modern indigenous North American genomes. Preliminary results, as noted, identified affinities with multiple existing groups, rather than a single clear descendant population, which could indicate that the settlement's people dispersed into multiple communities, or that they were genetically close to a common ancestor of multiple groups, and that their descendants are spread across a broader geographic area. The possibility that the community's history and the location of its settlement is preserved in the oral traditions of indigenous peoples in the region is one that the research team is actively pursuing. This requires time and trust and the kind of genuine partnership between researchers and community members that has not always characterized the relationship between archaeologists and Indigenous peoples in Canada. Building that trust is slow work, and it is work that cannot be rushed without jeopardizing the relationship. But several Indigenous elders in the region have indicated awareness of oral traditions that describe a community that lived at a lake, a community that was significant, a community whose memory has been passed down through generations. Whether those traditions refer to this settlement or to another one, and what information they contain about the lives and history of the people who live there, are questions that are being explored with care. The third profound question is what happened to the broader world that this settlement was part of. The evidence for long-distance connections, for exchange networks that brought exotic materials and possibly people from distant regions to this lakeside community, implies a world of interlinked communities across the northern landscape that we have only fragmentary knowledge of. The settlement is a node in a network, but we have found only the node. The rest of the network, the other communities, the roots of exchange, the shared knowledge and culture and history that link them, is still largely invisible. Reconstructing that network is one of the long-term goals of the research program that has grown up around the site. By analyzing the provenance of the exotic raw materials recovered from the site, by looking for parallels in the artifact typology and the symbolic vocabulary of the carved objects at other sites in the broader region, by using the ancient DNA data to look for genetic connections between the settlement's population and other ancient populations, the researchers are trying to sketch in the outlines of the world that this community inhabited. It is painstaking work with uncertain prospects for success, but it is exactly the right work to be doing. There is a fourth question that the discovery raises, and it is perhaps the most uncomfortable of all. The question of how many other settlements like this one are out there, sitting in silence under the cold, dark water of northern lakes, or under the accumulated sediment of landscapes that have been transformed beyond recognition since they were last inhabited. The conservative estimate, based on what we know about the distribution of glacial lakes in the Canadian subarctic and the evidence for widespread pre-Columbian occupation that is slowly accumulating in the archaeological record of the region, is that the number is not small. The realistic estimate is that we have found a tiny fraction of the archaeological heritage of the Canadian North. The troubling implication of that estimate is that much of what we have not found may be at risk. Climate change is transforming the northern landscape at an accelerating pace. Permafrost is thawing. Lake levels are shifting. Coastlines are eroding. The cold, stable conditions that have preserved archaeological sites across the Canadian North for thousands of years are changing. Sites that have survived in the ground for millennia may be destabilized and destroyed by permafrost thaw within decades. The window for finding and documenting them is narrower than it has been at any point in human history, and it is getting narrower every year. Deep time, deep knowledge. What the settlement teaches us about North America. Let us step back from the specifics of the site and the artifacts and the scientific debates for a moment and think about what this discovery means in a larger sense. What does it teach us? What should we take from it? The most immediate lesson is about the inadequacy of absence as evidence. For decades, the relative lack of known archaeological sites demonstrating complex permanent settlement in the Canadian subarctic was read as evidence that complex permanent settlement did not exist in the Canadian subarctic during the relevant periods. This is a fundamental logical error, but it is an error that has shaped how the discipline thought about the region and how the public was taught to understand it. The settlement beneath the lake was invisible. Its invisibility was produced by a specific set of circumstances, the rise in lake levels that buried the site under water and sediment. but its invisibility was not evidence of absence. It was simply invisibility. The site was there the whole time. This lesson applies far beyond this particular site and this particular region. The archaeological record of any time and place is a small and biased sample of the reality it purports to represent. It is biased toward materials that survive, toward contexts where preservation is favorable, toward locations where researchers have gone looking, toward interpretive frameworks that guide what researchers look for and what they notice when they find it. Every significant discovery, every site that turns out to be more ancient or more complex or more connected than the prevailing narrative predicted, is a reminder that the narrative is provisional, that the map is not the territory, that the absence of evidence in the record we have assembled so far is not equivalent to the absence of people and history and complexity in the actual past. The second lesson is about the depth of human habitation in North America. The story of the peopling of the Americas has been told in the popular imagination and in much of the academic literature as a relatively recent event, a few tens of thousands of years at most, with the earliest inhabitants of the continent being technologically simple, demographically sparse, and geographically constrained to the corridors opened by the receding glaciers. This story has been under sustained revision for decades, and the revisions have consistently been in the direction of greater antiquity, greater density, and greater complexity. The settlement beneath the lake is part of that revision. It is evidence of people who were here, building permanent structures and maintaining long-distance connections and burying their dead with ceremony, at a time and in a place where the conventional narrative was skeptical that any of those things were happening. The third lesson is about the relationship between indigenous knowledge and scientific investigation. The oral traditions and knowledge systems of the peoples whose ancestors inhabited northern Canada before, during, and after the period represented by the settlement are not supplementary or secondary sources of historical information. They are primary sources. They encode information about the past that in some cases goes back further than the available documentary or archaeological record, and that in many cases provides context and interpretive richness that the material evidence alone cannot offer. The gradual incorporation of indigenous knowledge into archaeological interpretation, which is happening across the field but unevenly and too slowly, is not a concession or a political accommodation. It is good science. It is what you do when you want a more accurate and complete picture of the past. The fourth lesson is the most humbling. We do not know, and have never known, as much as we thought we knew about the deep history of North America. The story of this continent before European contact is vastly older, vastly more complex, and vastly more human than the story that has been told in the standard histories. The settlement beneath the lake is one window into that real story. It shows us a community of real people with permanent homes and complex lives and connections to a world that stretched far beyond their horizon. It shows us that the idea of a vast, empty, simple North waiting to be discovered and developed by European arrivals was always a fiction, a convenient fiction for some purposes, but a fiction. Every time a lake is drained, every time a coastline erodes, every time a construction project cuts through the earth in a region that has been inhabited for thousands of years, there is the possibility of finding another window, another settlement, another community whose existence was invisible to us and whose discovery will require us to revise, again, the story we have been telling about the past. This is not cause for anxiety. It is cause for humility and for curiosity. The story of North America is longer and richer and stranger and more deeply human than we know. and we are only beginning, truly beginning, to tell it. The cold, dark water holds more secrets. There is something specific about the way bodies of water preserve the past that is worth sitting with for a long moment, because it is one of the stranger and more beautiful aspects of what this discovery reveals about the relationship between the physical world and human history. We tend to think of water as a force of erasure. Rivers carry sediment and rock and the detritus of the land out to sea. Floods damage and destroy. Rain dissolves. The ocean, over geological time, swallows coastlines whole. But water is also, under the right conditions, a preserver, a guardian of things that should have been lost. And understanding how it does this, understanding the specific chemistry and physics of preservation in cold northern lakes, is part of understanding why this discovery happened, and why it was possible, and why it matters. Cold water holds more dissolved oxygen than warm water, but the deepest parts of stratified northern lakes can become nearly anoxic during winter, when ice cover prevents atmospheric exchange and the biological activity that would consume organic material is reduced to near zero. This combination of cold temperatures and low or absent oxygen creates a chemical environment in which the microorganisms that drive decay in terrestrial environments simply cannot function effectively. Wood in such an environment can resist decomposition for centuries, under the right conditions, for millennia. The same applies to bone, to plant fiber, to hide, to any organic material that sinks to the bottom and is covered by the accumulating layer of fine sediment that rains down through the water. Column year after year, sealing the buried material in a stable, dark, cold, oxygen-poor tomb. This is not unique to northern Canada. It is the same principle that has preserved spectacular organic assemblages in bogs across northern Europe, in permanently waterlogged sites at the edges of rivers and marshes in many parts of the world, and at submerged sites in lakes and coastal waters, wherever the conditions happen to align. What is specific to this site is the combination of the cold climate, the depth of the lake, the specific chemistry of the local water, and the rapid inundation of the settlement that preserved it before substantial decay could occur. The geoarchaeological analysis of the sediment sequence is revealing the details of how this preservation happened, and the picture that is emerging is of an event that was rapid enough that the site was effectively sealed before the processes of biological decomposition could substantially reduce the organic content of its deposits. The fish traps that were identified at the edge of the settlement, in the zone between the main habitation area and the deeper water of the former lake, are another example of the extraordinary preservation at this site. Fish traps, weirs, and related structures built from wood and plant fiber are among the most archaeologically invisible components of the subsistence technology of northern peoples, precisely because the materials from which they are made decay quickly in terrestrial contexts. Finding them preserved here, still retaining enough of their original form to allow interpretation of their construction technique and likely function, is in the same category of archaeological fortune as the discovery of the Ozette site on the Washington coast, where a mudslide buried and preserved a Makah whaling village whose organic assemblage would otherwise have been entirely lost, giving researchers an unparalleled window into the material culture of a coastal indigenous community. At Ozette, the preservation conditions created by the covering mudslide were analogous in their effect to the preservation conditions created at this site by the rising lake. Both events sealed organic material rapidly and cut it off from the processes that would otherwise have destroyed it. Both events created archaeological sites of extraordinary richness and scientific value. The difference is one of visibility. The Ozette site was always on dry land, always technically accessible to investigation, discovered when the covering material began to erode away. The settlement beneath the lake was invisible for its entire post-inundation history, inaccessible without the specific combination of events that eventually lowered the water level and revealed the corner of the wall. How many other Ozetas are sitting under the lakes and bogs and coastal waters of northern North America, sealed by water or sediment, preserved by cold, waiting for a specific set of circumstances to bring them to light? The honest answer is that we do not know. The potentially disturbing answer, to anyone who thinks seriously about it, is that some of those sites may be closer to exposure than we realize, not because of human intervention, but because of the climate changes that are already reshaping the northern landscape. Permafrost thaw is exposing archaeological materials that have been frozen for thousands of years. In some cases, those materials are being documented before they decay. In other cases, the exposure and decay are happening faster than anyone can respond to them. The race between discovery and destruction is one of the defining challenges of northern archaeology in the 21st century. The settlement beneath the lake represents the good scenario. The discovery happened in time. The site was protected before it was destroyed. The materials were recovered and are being analyzed and will contribute to knowledge. But it happened by luck as much as by design, and the luck could easily have gone the other way, if the drainage had proceeded differently, if the corner of the wall had been in a part of the lakebed that remained submerged, if the site supervisor had walked in a different direction that morning. Any one of those small contingencies, and the settlement would still be invisible, still waiting, and there is no guarantee that the next opportunity would have come before the natural processes of decay, accelerated by climate change, reached the site and began to dismantle it. This is part of why the discovery has generated not just scientific excitement, but a kind of urgency within the profession. Not urgency to exploit the site for as much information as quickly as possible. That is the wrong kind of urgency. But urgency to develop the monitoring systems, the rapid response protocols, the funding mechanisms, and the community partnerships that would allow future discoveries of this kind to be handled well, rather than poorly or not at all. The settlement beneath the lake is a proof of concept for what can be found when the right conditions align. It is also a model for how such discoveries should be handled, and the people doing this work are aware that the model matters as much as the find. When a settlement is abandoned on dry land, it is immediately subject to the processes of decay and dispersal. Wooden structures begin to rot within years. Organic materials decompose. Artifacts are scattered by animal activity, by erosion, by subsequent human occupation. Within centuries, a substantial settlement can be reduced to a barely legible scatter of stone tools and fire-cracked rock and the faint discoloration of soil that a trained eye can read, but that is invisible to anyone who does not know what to look for. When a settlement is submerged, different processes take over. In cold, low-oxygen water, the microbial activity that drives decay in terrestrial environments is dramatically slowed. Organic materials that would be unrecognizable within decades on the surface can survive for thousands of years in the stable, sealed environment of a lakebed. Wood retains its structure. Plant fiber preserves its form. Bone maintains its integrity. The settlement can be essentially frozen in time, preserved in the condition it was in at the moment of inundation. This is one of the reasons that submerged archaeology has become an increasingly important frontier in the discipline. The sites that survive underwater or in formerly submerged environments are paradoxically often better preserved than sites that have been exposed at the surface for the same length of time. They represent a category of evidence that was largely inaccessible before the development of modern diving and remotely operated vehicle technology and that is only now beginning to be systematically explored. The Canadian subarctic has an extraordinary density of lakes. The Shield is a lake-scattered landscape that from the air looks like a land that is half water. Every one of those lakes has a history. Many of them were, at various points in the post-glacial period, at higher or lower levels than they are today. Many of them have experienced fluctuations in water level that could have submerged and preserved shoreline settlements in exactly the way that this lake preserved the settlement that was found within it. The potential for future discoveries is enormous, and the potential for those discoveries to continue reshaping our understanding of the pre-Columbian North is equally enormous. The drainage project that led to this discovery was in one sense a lucky accident. The site happened to be in the path of a water management initiative that happened to lower the lake level enough to expose it, and the site supervisor happened to notice the corner of a wall rather than walking past it, and the photographs happened to reach someone who recognized what they were seeing. In another sense, it was not luck at all. It was the inevitable result of a landscape that holds more than it reveals, of a history that is older and deeper than the story we have been telling, waiting for the right moment and the right set of eyes to come into view. There will be more such moments. There will be more drained lakes, more eroded banks, more construction trenches that cut through the accumulated layers of time and reveal something that should not be there, something that forces a reconsideration, another revision, another humbling reminder that the past is never as fully known as we think it is. Each of those moments will add to the picture. Each will complicate the narrative in ways that are ultimately enriching. Each will give us back a little more of the story that has been sitting in silence, in the cold, dark water, waiting to be told. The settlement at the bottom of that northern Canadian lake has been waiting for a very long time. It waited through the centuries when the people who built it moved away or were displaced or simply ceased to be, through the generations of their descendants who carried memories of this place in stories that may or may not survive, through the decades of colonial history that overlaid the northern landscape with new purposes and new narratives that had no room for the complexity and the depth of what had come before. It waited through the years of the drainage project's planning and approval and implementation, right up to the moment when the water receded far enough and a person walking across the muddy lake bed stopped and looked at the corner of a wall and thought that should not be there. Now it is found. Now it is in the record. Now it is part of the story, the long, still, incompletely told, extraordinary story of human presence in North America, a presence that reaches back further than we knew, and is deeper and richer and more astonishing than we had imagined. The land remembers, oral traditions, and the living connection. There is a way of understanding history that is different from the one practiced in universities and published in journals, though no less rigorous in its own terms and no less faithful to the complexity of the past. It is the way of knowing that lives in the voices of people who have been in a place for a very long time, who have carried the memory of that place through all the disruptions and all the attempts to silence them, and who speak about the land as though it is alive, because in their understanding of the world, it is. Several elders from indigenous communities in the broader region of the discovery have spoken publicly in recent years about their knowledge of lakes that hold memory, of places on the land that carry history in their water and their mud, of stories passed down through generations that describe communities at water's edge whose lives were shaped by the seasons of the fish and the migrations of the caribou and the movements of the birds. These stories are not identical across communities. They vary in detail and in the specific geography they describe, but they share a common understanding of the land as inhabited, as ancestral, as full of the presence of people who came before. when the researchers working on this site began the process of formal consultation with indigenous communities. One of the things that emerged from those conversations was a consistent, though carefully stated, sense of recognition. Not recognition of this specific site in the specific terms of its archaeological description, but recognition of the general truth that the site embodies, the truth that people were here, that people built lives here, that people had a deep and complex relationship with this landscape going back much further than the colonial period, or the period of written historical documentation. This was not news to the indigenous communities of the region. It was, from their perspective, simply the confirmation of something they had always known. One elder, speaking to a journalist who was covering the discovery for a regional publication, described the finding as the land showing what the lake was keeping safe. This is not the language of academic archaeology. It is also not incompatible with it. It describes the same reality from a different angle, through a different framework of understanding. The lake did keep the settlement safe. It preserved it through thousands of years in a way that no dry land site could have survived. The elders' way of describing that preservation attributed agency to the lake itself, understood the relationship between the water and the human history within it as a kind of guardianship. That is a different way of knowing than radiocarbon dating and lithic typology, but it is not a less true way of knowing. It is a way of knowing that has maintained the relationship between these peoples and this landscape across the entire span of time that the settlement represents and beyond. The consultation process has also opened conversations about the appropriate treatment of the site and its contents going forward. This is not a settled question. The interests of scientific investigation, which call for as complete an analysis as possible of the materials recovered, are in tension with indigenous community interests that may prioritize the treatment of ancestral remains and objects according to protocols that differ from those of the archaeological discipline. Finding a path through those tensions requires ongoing dialogue, mutual respect, and a genuine willingness on the part of the researchers to let indigenous communities take a central role in determining what happens to the heritage that this site represents. This kind of partnership, when it works, produces better science as well as more just outcomes. Indigenous knowledge about the regional landscape, the ecology, the seasonal patterns, the cultural significance of specific places and materials can inform archaeological interpretation in ways that make it more accurate as well as more complete. The people who have been in a place for a very long time know things about it that newcomers do not, and that laboratory analysis can sometimes confirm, but rarely generate on its own. The evidence from the site tells one kind of story. The oral traditions and living knowledge of the communities whose ancestors built it can help to tell another kind, and together they tell something closer to the truth than either alone could achieve. There is also a political dimension to this that is worth acknowledging, because the discovery of a significant pre-Columbian settlement in northern Canada has implications that extend beyond the purely academic. Indigenous communities across Canada have been engaged for decades in land rights negotiations and legal battles that turn in part on questions of historical occupation and connection to specific territories. The existence of a substantial, permanent settlement at the bottom of a lake in a region where indigenous communities assert historical territorial ties is a piece of evidence that is relevant to those negotiations. It is not the only piece, and it does not by itself settle questions that are far more complex than any single archaeological site can address. But it is part of the evidentiary record. The communities in the region have been careful, in their public statements about the discovery, not to frame it primarily as a political argument. They have spoken about it as confirmation of what they already knew, as recognition of what their stories already said, as another instance of the land revealing its history. But the political implications are real, and they are part of the context within which the discovery must be understood. What remains? The unsettled questions and the open horizon. We are several years past the initial discovery now. The drainage project that started, everything has long since concluded, though the original site has been protected under provincial heritage legislation, and the lake has not been refilled to its original level in the areas immediately over the settlement. A research station has been established near the site. A small team of archaeologists and graduate students works there during the summer field season each year. The analysis of the recovered materials is ongoing. The publications are beginning to appear in the academic literature, carefully worded, extensively footnoted, hedged in all the places where the evidence supports multiple interpretations. This is how science works, slowly, carefully, with appropriate uncertainty about claims that the evidence does not yet fully support. But the questions that the discovery has raised are not slow questions. They are urgent, pressing, fundamental questions about who we are and where we come from and what we have lost in the long process of building the world we now inhabit on top of the world that existed before we got here. Who built this settlement, and where did their descendants go? We do not fully know. The ancient DNA tells us something. The material culture tells us something. The oral traditions of the region's communities tell us something. Together they sketch a partial portrait of a community that was real and complex and deeply embedded in its landscape, but the full picture remains out of reach. How did the settlement come to be submerged, and why was it abandoned? We do not fully know. The geoarchaeological analysis is ongoing. The sediment sequence is being read. Hypotheses are being tested. But the specific sequence of events that ended this community's occupation of this place and sent them wherever they went is not yet fully reconstructed. How many other sites like this one are waiting to be discovered? We do not know. The honest answer is that the number is probably large, and that the fraction of those sites that will ever be found and properly investigated, given the resources currently devoted to northern archaeology and the pace at which climate change is transforming the landscape, is probably small. What does this discovery mean for our understanding of pre-Columbian North America as a whole? This is perhaps the most important question, and it is one that will only be answered over decades of continued research, continued discovery, and continued revision of the narrative we tell about the deep history of this continent. The settlement beneath the lake is a piece of that answer, a significant piece. But it is not the whole answer, and treating it as such would be a different kind of error than the one that led to the conventional narrative being built on too thin a base of evidence in the first place. What the discovery does, with clarity and force, is establish a proof of concept. It proves that the conventional narrative was inadequate. It proves that there is more history here, more complexity here, more humanity here than the standard account acknowledged. It proves that the absence of evidence in the record we had assembled was not evidence of absence in the past. It proves that the land holds secrets, that the water holds secrets, that the deep cold quiet of the subarctic conceals a history that is waiting for the right conditions and the right eyes and the right ears and the right questions to bring it to the surface. The corner of a wall in the mud, that is where this started, not with a grand expedition or a dramatic breakthrough or a moment of cinematic revelation. With a right angle in the sediment at the edge of a draining lake, noticed by someone who did not know what they were looking at, but knew enough to stop and look. That is how history comes back to us, not all at once, not in a flood, one right angle at a time, one artifact, one date, one genetic profile, one conversation with an elder, one story passed down through generations until the moment comes when someone is ready to listen. The settlement is there, the record is accumulating, the story is being told, and somewhere in the lakes and the rivers and the frozen ground of northern Canada, more of the story is waiting. The land remembers, the water keeps its secrets, and every time someone drains a lake, or erodes a bank, or cuts a trench in the right place at the right time, a little more of what the land remembers comes back to us. The corner of a wall in the mud, the beginning of a story that is older than any document, any monument, any empire, any civilization that North America has yet produced. A story that belongs to the people who lived here before all of that, whose descendants are still here, and whose history, finally, is beginning to be told. The stars above, the settlement, astronomy and symbolic knowledge. In the subarctic, one of the more quietly extraordinary elements of the evidence from this site is the cluster of findings that points toward a sophisticated engagement with the night sky. Astronomy is one of the oldest human intellectual pursuits. Long before people were recording their observations in writing, they were watching the sky and building what they saw into their understanding of time, of navigation, of the cycles that govern their lives. The subarctic sky, in particular, offers a spectacular field for observation. At high latitudes, the northern lights move across the darkness in curtains of green and violet and white. The summer solstice sun barely sets. The winter solstice delivers weeks of near total darkness during which the stars are extraordinary in their clarity and their density. People who lived under that sky, season after season, generation after generation, would have known it intimately. The evidence from the settlement for astronomical awareness comes from several directions. The orientation of the structures is one. The largest building, the central rectangular structure, identified as potentially communal or ceremonial in function, is oriented on an axis that the site's geoarchaeologists have noted aligns closely with the direction of sunrise at the winter solstice. This alignment could be coincidental. It could also be deliberate. At other subarctic and Arctic archaeological sites, structural alignments with solstitial and equinoctial sunrise and sunset directions have been documented and interpreted as evidence for astronomical knowledge embedded in architectural practice. The alignment at this settlement has not been definitively interpreted in either direction, but it has been noted, documented, and added to the growing file of intriguing features that the full analysis will eventually need to address. The carved wooden disc with the concentric circle and radiating line pattern is another piece of potential evidence. This kind of motif, which occurs in rock art and portable art contexts across a vast geographic range in North America and beyond, has been interpreted by various researchers as a solar or celestial symbol, a representation of the sun or of celestial phenomena embedded in the symbolic vocabulary of the community that made it. The interpretation is not settled. Not every concentric circle in the archaeological record is an astronomical symbol. Many are purely geometric and decorative. But the combination of this particular motif on a portable object, found in a context associated with the largest and most significant building at the site, in a community where the structural alignment evidence hints at solar awareness, makes the astronomical interpretation worth taking seriously. More concrete is the evidence from the analysis of notched bone pieces recovered from the site. Among the worked bone assemblage were several elongated pieces, clearly not functional tools, bearing series of incised notches arranged in patterns. The analysis of these patterns by a specialist in ancient enumeration and notation systems identified sequences that she described as potentially consistent with lunar cycle tracking, the systematic recording of the phases of the moon over a period of months. Lunar tracking in pre-literate societies is well documented ethnographically and archaeologically. The moon, with its regular and predictable cycle, serves as a calendar in many traditional cultures, marking the passage of time, regulating ceremonial schedules, and tracking the approach of seasons and resource availability, events like fish runs and animal migrations. If the notched bones from this site represent a form of lunar notation, and the specialist who analyzed them was careful to frame this as a possibility rather than a certainty, then they are evidence for a level of systematic, recorded astronomical observation that goes well beyond casual sky watching. They imply a community that was actively tracking the passage of time, that had developed a system for recording and communicating temporal information, and that integrated this knowledge into the management of its activities and its relationships with the natural world around it. This is sophisticated. It is the kind of cognitive practice that we more readily associate with the great civilizations of the ancient world than with what we have been taught to expect of subarctic peoples in the pre-Columbian North. And yet the evidence is there in the notched bone, in the structural alignment, in the carved symbolic disc pointing toward a community whose relationship with the sky was rich and systematic and woven into the fabric of its daily and ceremonial life. The northern lights themselves deserve a mention in this context. The aurora borealis is among the most dramatic natural phenomena visible from high northern latitudes, and it has held deep cultural and spiritual significance for the northern peoples of North America, Scandinavia, and Siberia across recorded history. Indigenous traditions from across the circumpolar north attribute agency and meaning to the aurora, understanding it as the movement of spirits or ancestors or as a communication from other realms. What the people of this particular settlement believed about the northern lights is, of course, impossible to recover directly from the archaeological record, but they would have seen them regularly. On clear winter nights, the great curtains of light moving across the sky above their settlement. Whatever stories they told about what they were seeing, whatever ceremonies or responses those stories implied, were part of a life that was lived under one of the most visually extraordinary skies on the planet. The material evidence of their astronomical engagement, partial and ambiguous as it is a reminder that this was not a community of people looking at the ground. It was a community of people looking up. Echoes in the ice. What other northern discoveries tell us about this one? Every significant archaeological discovery is most fully understood in context, and the context of this settlement is not limited to the immediate region of the Canadian subarctic. It extends across the circumpolar north into the archaeology of Scandinavia and Siberia and the Arctic coast, into the growing body of research on the peopling and habitation of the high latitudes of the northern hemisphere from the end of the last ice age through the period of European contact. Placing this settlement within that broader context reveals connections and parallels that deepen its significance, and that point toward a shared human story of northern adaptation that crosses the geographic and political boundaries we have imposed on the landscape in much more recent times. The peoples of the circumpolar north have been connected across enormous distances for a very long time. The genetic evidence for this is now substantial. Modern and ancient DNA studies have identified connections between indigenous populations in Siberia, Alaska, Arctic Canada, and Greenland that reflect multiple waves of migration and sustained gene flow across a vast geographic arc spanning tens of thousands of kilometers. The material culture evidence reinforces this picture. Similar tool forms, similar artistic traditions, similar approaches to the construction of cold weather dwellings and the processing of marine and terrestrial resources appear across this geographic range in ways that cannot be explained by independent invention alone. These are connected peoples. They have been in communication, directly or through intermediary communities for a very long time. The Dorset culture of the eastern Arctic and subarctic of Canada, named for Cape Dorset on Baffin Island, is one of the most extensively studied pre-Columbian cultural traditions of northern North America. Occupying the region from roughly 4,500 years ago to about 1,000 years ago, Dorset peoples were extraordinary craftspeople and artists whose cultural record is preserved across a wide geographic range. Dorset art, in particular, is justly famous among those who know it. Small carved figures in bone and ivory, many of them depicting animals or anthropomorphic figures with a subtlety and expressiveness that is genuinely striking, represent a tradition of artistic production that matches or exceeds anything produced in the region in subsequent periods. The Dorset peoples were ultimately replaced or absorbed by the Thule tradition, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, who expanded eastward from Alaska roughly 1,000 years ago, and within a few centuries had spread across the entire Arctic from Alaska to Greenland. The details of what happened between Dorset and Thule peoples are still debated by researchers. The two traditions overlapped geographically and temporally for a period, and the nature of their interactions, whether competitive, cooperative, or some combination, is not fully understood. But what is clear is that the Arctic and subarctic of North America supported complex, sophisticated, artistically, and technologically remarkable cultures for thousands of years before European contact, cultures whose histories are only partially recovered in the existing archaeological record. The settlement beneath the northern Canadian lake predates the Dorset tradition and is geographically at the southern margin of the region, associated with Arctic coast cultural traditions in the transitional zone between the boreal forest and the tundra, where different cultural worlds met and interacted. This boundary zone, which archaeologists sometimes call the subarctic, is itself underrepresented in the research literature relative to the cultures on either side of it. The dramatic finds from the Arctic coast, the Dorset carvings, and the Thule house mounds have tended to attract more attention than the quieter, harder to preserve record of the interior subarctic. The settlement beneath the lake is a reminder that this interior zone had its own history, its own communities, its own contributions to the story of human life in the north. In Scandinavia, the archaeology of the Mesolithic and Neolithic periods tells a story of northern peoples that in some ways parallels the story emerging from this Canadian discovery. The Mesolithic peoples of Scandinavia, roughly contemporaneous with earlier phases of the occupation period represented at the Canadian site, were living in permanent or semi-permanent settlements at the edges of lakes and rivers, fishing and hunting and gathering in sophisticated and organized ways, maintaining long-distance exchange networks that brought exotic materials from distant sources, and engaging in ceremonial practices that left traces in the archaeological record in the form of elaborate burials and structured deposits of significant objects. The parallels with the evidence from the Canadian site are not exact, but they are striking, and they suggest that the pattern of sophisticated northern lake edge settlement with complex social organization and long-distance connections is not unique to this site or this region, but represents a broader northern human adaptation to the particular resources and challenges of the boreal and subarctic zones. In Siberia, the archaeology of the prehistoric period has consistently revealed greater complexity and greater antiquity of human occupation than the conventional narrative had predicted. Sites that push the dates of human arrival in specific regions of Siberia further back than expected, that reveal evidence of long-distance connection across the vast Siberian landscape, that show sophisticated artistic and symbolic production from periods much earlier than the conventional narrative allowed for, have been accumulating in the Siberian archaeological literature for decades. The relevance to the Canadian discovery is indirect but real. The peoples of the subarctic and Arctic North, on both sides of the Bering Strait, share ancient genetic and cultural connections. The sophistication documented at the Siberian sites reflects a northern human tradition that was not confined to any one region, but expressed itself across the circumpolar world in locally specific but broadly connected forms. The ice cores drilled from the Greenland ice sheet have contributed another dimension to the context of this discovery. Ice cores record the history of the atmosphere in extraordinary detail, preserving year by year the climate signal of past centuries and millennia in the layered ice. The climate record from the Greenland cores covers the entire period of occupation represented at the Canadian settlement, and it reveals a climate history that was not static. The mid-Holocene, the broad period that includes the occupation of this settlement, included intervals of both warmer and cooler conditions than today in the high latitudes, with implications for the habitability of the subarctic landscape and for the resources available to the communities living there. Understanding how the settlement's occupation related to this climate history is one of the goals of the ongoing research, and integrating the site's record with the ice core data is part of the analytical program that is currently underway. What all of this comparative context tells us is that the settlement beneath the northern Canadian lake was not an isolated anomaly in a blank landscape. It was a node in a world, a northern world that extended from Scandinavia to Siberia to Alaska to the interior of the Canadian subarctic, a world in which people had been living and moving and connecting and exchanging for a very long time, a world that was sophisticated and complex and deeply human in ways that the conventional narrative of pre-Columbian North America has consistently underestimated. Finding this node, recovering its record, beginning to understand its connections and its history is a step toward recovering the full complexity of that northern world. It is a step that was long overdue, and it is a step that points toward many more discoveries, many more recoveries, many more revisions of the story we tell about who we are and where we come from and how long and how richly we have been here. The weight of what is lost, reckoning with what we will never recover. There is a grief in archaeology that does not often get spoken aloud in papers and conference presentations, a grief that practitioners carry quietly through their careers. It is the grief of understanding with increasing clarity as the years go on how much is gone, how much has been destroyed, how much has been lost not to time alone but to deliberate and systematic disregard, to the priorities of colonialism and industrialization and a modernity that was built in significant part on the erasure of what came before. In northern Canada, the losses are both material and cultural. The material losses are the sites, the objects, the records of past human lives that were disturbed, excavated carelessly, removed without proper documentation, or simply destroyed by development before anyone with the knowledge and the authority to intervene was even aware they existed. These losses happened across the entire period of European settlement in Canada, and they continued into the 20th century, and in some cases are still happening. The speed of development in remote northern regions, driven by resource extraction industries and infrastructure projects, has consistently outpaced the capacity of the archaeological profession to identify, assess, and protect the heritage that lies in the path of that development. Sites that would have generated research programs and significant contributions to knowledge have been destroyed by bulldozers and explosives and road cuts and dam construction, leaving behind nothing but the occasional recovered artifact and the knowledge that something was there, something that is now gone. The cultural losses are in some ways harder to quantify and harder to confront. The languages of the subarctic peoples of Canada are among the world's most endangered. Many are spoken by only a handful of elders. When those speakers are gone, something irreplaceable goes with them. Not merely a vocabulary, not merely a grammar, a way of understanding the world, a way of encoding knowledge about the landscape and its history and its resources, a set of concepts and categories that exist in that language and in no other, that the language's speakers have developed over centuries of intimate engagement with their environment, and that cannot be fully translated into any other tongue, because the concepts themselves are specific to the cultural and ecological context in which the language grew. The oral traditions that may contain information about the settlement beneath the lake, about the people who built it, and about what happened to them, are part of this endangered heritage. They are surviving in communities that have been under sustained pressure for generations to abandon everything that makes them distinctive in favor of assimilation into the dominant culture. Some of those traditions have been lost. Some are remembered only partially, fragments detached from the broader context that would give them their full meaning. Some survive intact in the memories of elders who have not yet found the right conditions, the right listeners, the right moment to share them fully. This is part of what makes the settlement beneath the lake significant beyond the academic. It is not merely a scientific discovery. It is a piece of reclaimed history, history that was always there, but that was made invisible by the convergence of physical circumstance and intellectual and political neglect. Finding it, and finding it in the condition it was found in, is a rare opportunity to recover something that by all rights should have been lost. And engaging with it in the right way, with the right partnerships, and the right respect for the communities whose ancestors it represents, is an opportunity to do something that archaeology does not always do, to give something back. The researchers who have been working on this site are aware of this responsibility. It is reflected in the protocols they have adopted for the treatment of human remains, in the consultation processes they have established with indigenous communities, in the willingness to share data and findings with community members, rather than restricting access to the academic sphere. It is reflected in the growing recognition within the profession that the story of the past belongs to everyone, and particularly to the communities most directly descended from the people whose past it is. This is not a universally held view within archaeology, and the tensions between different conceptions of who owns the past and who has the right to study and interpret it are real and ongoing. But the settlement beneath the lake, precisely because it is so significant and so clearly connected to living communities with historical stakes in its interpretation, is pushing those conversations forward in productive ways. There is something important in the fact that this settlement was preserved by water, not by human intention, not by conscious conservation, by the cold, dark indifference of a northern lake that covered the evidence of a community's existence and held it in suspension for thousands of years, waiting. The water did not choose to preserve the settlement, but the settlement survived because of the water. And now that it has been found, the responsibility for what happens to its memory, to the knowledge it represents, to the community it speaks for, falls not on water, but on people, on the researchers who study it, on the communities who claim it, on the institutions that fund and govern the work, and on anyone who engages with its story, including the person listening to this, right now, in whatever part of the world, and whatever hour of the night you find yourself in. The story of the settlement belongs to the people who lived it, but the responsibility for what happens to that story now belongs to all of us. That corner of a wall changed the questions we ask about northern Canada. Not all at once, not with a clean resolution, but in the way that real discoveries work, by opening a door that was always there, but that nobody had been standing in front of, at the right moment with the right pair of eyes. The people who built that settlement did not know they were making history. They were just living, building structures for the cold and fishing in the autumn runs and burying their dead with ochre and ceremony and passing their knowledge forward. The lake held all of it in the cold and the dark and the silence for a very long time. It is still holding most of it. What we have found is only the beginning of what there is to find, and the finding changes everything. Consider what it means to stand at the edge of that drained lakebed and look at what the water gave back. You're not looking at ruins in any diminished sense of that word. You're looking at a place where people made decisions every single day, where children learned the names of plants and the behavior of fish, where elders passed judgment and told stories and watched the northern lights, with eyes that understood the sky in ways that nobody recorded and few have tried to recover. None of that is visible in the mud. None of it shows up in the radiocarbon dates or the faunal analysis or the lithic typology. And yet, all of it was real. All of it happened. The archaeology can only ever gesture at the edges of it. That is the humbling part. Not the age of the site, though the age is extraordinary. Not the complexity of the artifact assemblage, though the complexity is far beyond what the conventional narrative predicted. The humbling part is the recognition that even with everything recovered and analyzed and published, even with every bone counted and every piece of worked stone cataloged, and every trace of organic material subjected to the most sensitive laboratory techniques available, we are still only seeing a shadow of the community that actually existed here. The people themselves are gone. Their voices are gone. Their language is gone, or at least the particular form of it that was spoken on this lakeshore is gone, absorbed into subsequent generations of change and loss and adaptation. What remains is the material trace of a life that was fully lived, in a place that held it carefully for thousands of years and returned it to us in pieces that we are only now beginning to understand. The north is full of lakes. Every single one of them has a floor, and the floor of every one of them is a potential archive, a potential record, a potential window into lives and times that we have not yet found the means or the will to look at directly. The settlement beneath this particular lake was one accident of circumstance away from remaining invisible forever. That fact should sit with anyone who cares about the deep history of North America, and it should ask something of all of us. Not every lake can be drained, not every archive can be opened, but the ones that can, when they are, deserve exactly the kind of careful, respectful, patient, and unflinching attention that this discovery has begun to receive, because the people who lived here deserve to be remembered, and remembering them, even imperfectly, even through the fragmentary language of archaeology and genetics and geoarchaeology, is the least that the present owes to the past, and perhaps that is the real weight of what the drained lake returned to us. Not just the structures, not just the artifacts, not just the dates and the data and the analysis, but the obligation, the quiet, non-negotiable obligation that comes with finding proof that someone was here before you, someone who loved and mourned and built and endured, someone whose existence the landscape remembered even when the historical record did not. A single right angle in the mud, that is all it took. One corner of one wall, barely visible above the retreating waterline on an ordinary morning in the northern spring. And from that one detail, an entire world began to come back. Not completely, not cleanly, but enough to know it existed, enough to know it mattered, enough to understand that the silence of these northern landscapes was never truly silence at all. It was always a conversation waiting for someone to stop moving long enough to listen.